So, Maya, how do you spend your $3,400,000 trust fund? My grandfather asked the question with such casual warmth, his eyes twinkling across the Sunday dinner table, genuinely curious, the way he might ask about my favorite restaurant or what book I was reading. And for a moment, the words didn't even register because they made no sense strung together in that particular order applied to me. I set down my fork, the sound too loud against my mother's good china, and blinked at him. What trust fund? The silence that followed felt like falling, that stomach-dropping sensation when you miss a step in the dark. My grandfather Thomas's smile faltered, confusion creasing his weathered face. Your trust fund, sweetheart. The one I established when you were born. Both you girls. He gestured vaguely between me and my older sister Charlotte, who had gone very still in her chair beside her husband Derek. I watched my mother Jennifer's face transform, a flash of something like panic before her expression smoothed into careful blankness. Dad, this isn't the time, she said quietly, reaching for the wine bottle even though her glass was still half full. We can discuss this later. But my grandfather was frowning now, looking between us with dawning concern. Jennifer, you did tell Maya about the trust, didn't you? She turned 25 3 years ago. 3 years ago. I had turned 25 3 years ago, celebrated with a small dinner at my studio apartment with two friends from graduate school, my mother distracted and checking her phone throughout, leaving early with some excuse I couldn't even remember now. I was 28 now, 28 years old, and sitting at this formal dining table in my sister's beautiful home in the suburbs, a home I'd been told Derek's family money had purchased, wearing a dress I'd bought on clearance because my budget from my $42,000 annual salary as a social worker didn't leave much room for the kind of clothes my sister wore so effortlessly. I don't understand, I said, and my voice sounded strange even to myself, distant and thin. What trust fund? Charlotte was examining her perfectly manicured nails with sudden, intense focus. Derek cleared his throat uncomfortably. My mother set down the wine bottle with a sharp click. Maya, this is hardly the time or place for this conversation. Grandpa is confused. We'll talk about this at home. But Thomas was shaking his head, his expression shifting from confusion to something harder, something I'd rarely seen on his kind face. I'm not confused, Jennifer. I'm 82, not senile. I established identical trusts for both my granddaughters in 1995, $1 million each, now worth approximately $3,400,000 through conservative investments. Both girls were supposed to be informed on their 23rd birthdays and given full control at 25. He turned to me, and I saw real distress in his eyes. Maya, you really didn't know about this? I shook my head slowly, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat, and I watched my sister's face, searching for surprise that matched my own, but Charlotte wouldn't look at me, and in that avoidance, I found an answer that made my chest ache. This conversation is over, my mother said sharply, standing abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Maya, we're leaving. I followed my mother home that night, my hands gripping the steering wheel of my 7-year-old Honda Civic so tightly my knuckles ached, and when we both pulled into the driveway of her townhouse, I was out of my car before she'd even turned off her engine, my heart pounding against my ribs like something trying to break free. She couldn't avoid this conversation, couldn't smooth it over with her usual dismissive deflections, not after what Grandpa Thomas had said at that dinner table. Not after the way Charlotte had looked anywhere but at me. Not after a lifetime of feeling like I was somehow less than my sister. And finally having a concrete reason why. My mother moved slowly, getting out of her car, gathering her purse with deliberate care, and I recognized the tactic because I'd seen it 1,000 times before. This strategic delay she employed whenever a conversation threatened to veer into territory she didn't want to explore, but tonight I wouldn't let her retreat into vague reassurances and subject changes. Mom, we're talking about this right now, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. All those years of de-escalating crisis situations at the center, teaching me how to sound calm, even when everything inside me was screaming. She sighed, a long, suffering sound that set my teeth on edge, and unlocked her front door without looking at me. Maya, you're being dramatic. This isn't as significant as you're making it. I followed her inside, into the living room I'd sat in countless times feeling inadequate without understanding why, and I positioned myself between her and the kitchen, blocking her usual escape route. Is there a trust fund? Yes or no? She set down her purse on the console table, adjusted it even though it didn't need adjusting, and finally met my eyes with an expression that mingled defensiveness and something that might have been guilt if I was being generous. Yes, there's a trust fund. Your grandfather established accounts for both you girls when you were born. $1 million each that have grown through investments to approximately $3,400,000. The casual way she said it, like she was confirming the time or commenting on the weather, made my stomach turn. And Charlotte accessed hers when she turned 25. It wasn't a question, but my mother nodded anyway. She used it for the down payment on her house, started an investment portfolio, launched her consulting business on the side. She's been very responsible with it. Responsible. Charlotte had been responsible with money she knew she had, while I'd been irresponsible for struggling with student loans. I could have paid off completely with a fraction of an inheritance I'd never been told existed. I'm 28, Mom. I turned 25 3 years ago. My mother moved past me into the kitchen, filling the kettle even though neither of us wanted tea, her hands busy with the familiar ritual. I know how old you are, Maya. I was there when you were born. The deflection was so typical it almost made me laugh, but nothing about this was funny. Nothing about this was anything except a betrayal so fundamental I couldn't quite process the scope of it yet. Why didn't you tell me? She kept her back to me, watching the kettle like it might explode, her shoulders rigid. The timing never seemed right. You were finding yourself, changing majors, dating that musician with the tattoos, choosing social work over more practical careers. I didn't want to burden you with this kind of financial responsibility before you were ready. Burden me. She'd framed keeping $3,400,000 from me as protection, as if knowledge of my own inheritance was somehow dangerous. Charlotte was told when she turned 23. I'm 28. The kettle began to whistle, and my mother poured water over a tea bag with excessive concentration. Your sister has always been more financially mature. She understands investments, planning, long-term thinking. I wanted to wait until you'd settled into your career, until you'd demonstrated some stability. Each word landed like a slap. This assessment of my worth that had been made without my knowledge, this judgment that had cost me 3 years of choices I should have been able to make for myself. Who else knows? Does Derek know? She turned finally, holding her mug like a shield. Charlotte's husband is aware of her financial situation, yes. It's not something we discussed extensively, but he knows. So my sister's husband knew about my inheritance before I did. This stranger who'd married into our family had been privy to information about my own life that I'd been systematically denied. You are the trustee. My mother nodded slowly. Your grandfather named me as trustee until you turned 25, yes. I had a fiduciary responsibility to manage the funds, which I did. The money is still there, Maya. Nothing has been lost. I drove home in a daze that night, my mother's words about financial maturity and stability echoing in my head like accusations. And when I finally sat down at my laptop in my cramped studio apartment, I started searching through my memories, the way you might search through old files looking for something you know must be there, but can never quite find. Charlotte's new car when she was 23, a sleek silver Lexus that she'd driven to my graduate school graduation, and when I'd admired it, she'd said casually that Derek's family had given it to her as an early wedding gift, which had made sense at the time because Derek's parents were wealthy and generous, and I'd had no reason to question it. But Charlotte had only been dating Derek for 6 months at that point, hardly long enough for his family to be buying her $40,000 vehicles. And now I understood that the car had been purchased with her trust fund money, money from an inheritance I hadn't known existed while I was taking the bus to my unpaid internship placements. Her wedding 4 years ago, this extravagant affair at a country club with 200 guests and a live band and flowers that must have cost more than I made in 6 months. And when I'd hesitantly asked our mother how they were affording such an elaborate celebration, she'd told me that Derek's parents were paying for most of it as their gift to the couple. And I'd felt a complicated mix of happiness for my sister and inadequacy about my own circumstances, dating a musician who played in dive bars and living in an apartment where the heating barely worked. I remembered her salary that had always seemed impossibly high for someone only 2 years out of college, how she'd casually mentioned making investments and maxing out her retirement accounts, and I'd assumed she was just better at negotiating than I was, more aggressive about asking for raises, more willing to prioritize money over meaningful work the way I'd been told I should be. My own 25th birthday came back to me with painful clarity now. That small dinner at my apartment with 2 friends from my graduate program, the cheap wine I'd bought on sale, my mother arriving late and leaving early, checking her phone repeatedly and seeming distracted and almost irritable, and I'd attributed her mood to stress at work or general disapproval of my life choices, never imagining that she was sitting across from me on the exact day she was legally required to inform me about my inheritance and choosing silence instead. When I'd turned 26, drowning in $67,000 of student loan debt from my master's degree in social work, I'd finally worked up the courage to ask my mother for help, just a small loan to pay down the highest interest loans, and she'd looked at me with something like disappointment and said, "You need to learn financial responsibility, Maya. You can't expect bailouts every time things get difficult." And I'd felt ashamed of asking, had apologized for being irresponsible, had gone back to my studio apartment and cried while making a budget that barely covered my expenses. Charlotte had no student loans, I remembered suddenly. And when I'd asked her about it once, she'd said vaguely that our mother had found scholarships and that she'd worked through college, but I'd worked through college too, had worked 2 jobs while taking a full course load, and I'd still graduated with debt that felt like a weight I'd carry forever. They'd all known, I realized as I sat there in the blue light of my laptop screen at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night. Charlotte had known about both trust funds since she was 23, had known about my inheritance while watching me struggle, had known while I ate ramen for dinner and wore clothes from thrift stores and delayed going to the dentist because I couldn't afford the copay. My mother had known, had actively kept this information from me while telling me I needed to learn responsibility, while letting me believe my struggles were the natural consequences of my choices, rather than the manufactured result of her deception. Derek probably knew, this man who'd married into our family and sat at holiday dinners watching me in my clearance rack dresses, while his wife wore designer labels purchased with money that had come from the same source as mine, money I hadn't known existed. I called Grandpa Thomas the next morning from my desk at the crisis center during my lunch break, my hands shaking as I dialed his number, and when he answered with his usual warm, "Maya, sweetheart," I felt something in my chest crack open because here was someone who had always treated me with kindness and respect, who had apparently set up a trust fund to secure my future and had no idea his own daughter had kept it from me for years. "Grandpa, I need to see the paperwork for the trust fund, all of it. Can I come over today after work?" There was a pause, and then his voice came back quieter, weighted with something that sounded like anger. "She didn't tell you anything, did she? Even after last night?" I confirmed that my mother had admitted the trust existed, but had been vague about details, defensive about her choices, and I heard him make a sound of disgust that I'd never heard from him before. "Come at 6. I'll have everything ready." His house in the suburbs was the same as it had always been. The brick colonial where Charlotte and I had spent countless afternoons as children. And when he opened the door, he pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than usual, and I realized he was angry on my behalf. this 82-year-old man who had tried to do something generous for his granddaughters and was only now discovering how that generosity had been corrupted. He led me to his study, that wood-paneled room that smelled like old books and leather, and on his desk sat two thick folders, identical except for the names typed on the labels: Charlotte Ann Mitchell Trust and Maya Rose Mitchell Trust. He sat down heavily in his chair and gestured for me to take the seat across from him. I established both trusts in 1995, when you girls were born. $1 million each, invested conservatively in index funds and bonds. The money has grown to approximately $400,000 in each account through careful management and reinvestment of dividends. He opened my folder and pulled out the original trust document. Pages of legal language that I scanned quickly, looking for the parts that mattered. Your mother was named as trustee because your grandmother had already passed, and Jennifer was the logical choice as your parent. The instructions were explicit, Maya. Both girls were to be informed of the trusts on their 23rd birthdays, given full details of the amounts and management. At age 25, control was to be transferred completely, with the trustee role ending. He pointed to a highlighted section, and I read the words that made my hands clench. The trustee shall inform the beneficiary of this trust's existence, purpose, and value no later than the beneficiary's 23rd birthday, providing annual statements thereafter, and shall transfer all control and access to the beneficiary on the beneficiary's 25th birthday. It was there, in black and white. This requirement my mother had ignored completely. Grandpa Thomas pulled out another stack of papers, annual statements going back years, and I saw my mother's signature on each one, acknowledging receipt, confirming the growing balance. She's been getting these every year. She knew exactly how much was in your account, knew it was meant for you, knew she was required to tell you. Then he showed me something that made my stomach drop, a separate accounting document that detailed trustee fees. And there, in careful columns, I saw the amounts my mother had been paid for managing my trust, 2% annually, which had grown along with the principal, $68,000 per year for the last 3 years since I'd turned 25, money she'd collected for managing an account she should have already transferred to me, fees that totaled $204,000 that she'd taken from my inheritance while I'd been struggling to pay rent. I called in sick to work the next morning, the first personal day I'd taken in 8 months, and I found myself sitting in the reception area of Chen & Associates at 9:30 with a folder full of documents that represented both my grandfather's generosity and my mother's betrayal, waiting to meet with Rebecca Chen, the trust and estate attorney whose name Grandpa Thomas had given me, along with a quiet, "She's tough, she's fair, and she'll tell you the truth." Rebecca was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes behind frameless glasses, and when she invited me into her office and asked me to explain the situation, I found myself telling the whole story, my voice cracking when I got to the part about asking my mother for help with my student loans while she was collecting $68,000 annually from money that was legally mine. Rebecca listened without interrupting, making notes on a yellow legal pad, and when I finished, she spent 20 minutes reviewing every document I'd brought: the original trust agreement, the annual statements, the fee schedules, her expression growing increasingly serious as she read. "This is a clear breach of fiduciary duty," she said finally, setting down the papers and looking at me directly. "Your mother had explicit instructions to inform you at 23 and transfer control at 25. She did neither. The continued collection of trustee fees after the mandatory transfer date is potentially fraudulent and, depending on how a court interprets her actions, could rise to the level of embezzlement." The words hung in the air between us, these legal terms that transformed my mother's actions from family dysfunction into actual crimes, and I felt something shift in my chest, a kind of validation that what had happened to me wasn't just hurtful, but legally wrong. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice gentle but professional. "The question is what you want to do about it. You have several options, ranging from a simple demand letter, requesting immediate transfer of the trust, to a full lawsuit seeking return of the fees, damages for your losses, and potentially removal of your mother as trustee with prejudice. This is your mother, Maya. I need to know how far you're willing to go. I thought about my studio apartment with its broken heating, about last winter's pneumonia that I'd tried to treat with over-the-counter medicine because I couldn't afford the urgent care copay, about the nonprofit I'd dreamed of starting that I'd abandoned as impossible because I didn't have resources while $3 million sat in an account with my name on it, generating fees for the woman who'd kept it secret. What would you advise at minimum? I asked, my hands shaking slightly in my lap. Rebecca didn't hesitate. At absolute minimum, you should demand immediate transfer of the full trust balance, return of the $204,000 in fees she collected after your 25th birthday, and a complete accounting of every transaction since the trust was established. She needs to document where every penny went, especially if she claims she made investments on your behalf. And you need this in writing, with a deadline, so if she refuses to comply, you have grounds for legal action. She paused, studying my face. I can draft a formal demand letter, send it to your mother with copies to your grandfather and your sister. It will be very clear about the legal implications of her actions and the consequences if she doesn't comply. 14 days is standard for this type of demand. I sat there in that office with its diplomas on the wall and its view of the downtown buildings where people made important decisions every day, and I thought about how I'd spent my whole life trying not to be a burden, trying not to ask for too much, accepting whatever scraps of attention and resources my mother decided to give me, while Charlotte got everything freely and abundantly. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady when I said, "Write the letter." I needed to talk to Charlotte before Rebecca sent the demand letter, some part of me still hoping that my sister might have an explanation that would make this hurt less, that maybe she hadn't known about my trust fund or had assumed I knew too, and so I texted her asking to meet for coffee at the Grind, the place near the university where we used to study together when I was in grad school, and she was working her first marketing job, back when I still believed we were close despite our differences. She arrived 15 minutes late, which was typical, wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and when she slid into the booth across from me, she was already defensive, her shoulders tight, like she knew why I'd asked to meet. I didn't ease into it, didn't make small talk about the weather or her job or Derek. I just asked the question that had been burning in my chest since I'd seen those trust documents in Grandpa's study. Did you know about my trust fund? The color drained from her face and she looked down at her latte, at the foam heart the barista had made, and the silence stretched between us for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. And when she finally spoke, her voice was small. Yes, I knew. Something in my chest cracked, some last fragile hope that this had all been a misunderstanding, and I heard my own voice come out flat and cold. How long? She still wouldn't meet my eyes, picking at her napkin instead, shredding it into tiny pieces. Since I was 23. Mom told me about mine and she mentioned that you had one too, the same amount, that we'd both get access at 25. The casual way she said it, like it was just information she'd happened to have, made my hands clench around my coffee cup. Why didn't you tell me? And then the excuses came tumbling out. A waterfall of justifications that she'd probably been rehearsing in her head since Grandpa's question at dinner had blown everything open. She thought Mom would tell me eventually. It wasn't her place to get involved in what Mom decided. She didn't want to cause problems between me and Mom. She figured there was some reason for the delay that she didn't understand, and then the one that made something inside me break completely. You seemed happy with your simple life anyway. You were always talking about how meaningful your work was, how you didn't need material things to be fulfilled. I stared at her, this woman who shared my DNA and my childhood, and apparently nothing else that mattered. My simple life, Charlotte? I've been eating ramen and taking double shifts at the crisis center while you bought a $500,000 house with money from a trust fund identical to the one no one told me existed. I asked Mom for help with my student loans, and she told me I needed to learn financial responsibility while she was collecting $68,000 a year from my inheritance. Charlotte's face flushed, and her voice went sharp, defensive. That's not fair, Maya. You're making it sound like I did something wrong when I just used money that was legally mine. You're not entitled to information about my finances, and honestly, you're being pretty dramatic about this whole thing. The word dramatic hit me like a slap, this dismissal that I'd heard my whole life whenever I tried to express hurt or need or disappointment. And I stood up because I couldn't sit across from her for another second without saying things I might regret. I'm being dramatic? I've been kept in artificial poverty for 3 years while you built wealth and security with your trust and watched me struggle and said nothing. That's not drama, Charlotte. That's betrayal. I left her sitting there in the coffee shop, left my half-finished cup and my shredded napkin and whatever remained of our sisterhood, and I texted Rebecca from my car with shaking hands. Send the letter. Rebecca sent the demand letter on a Wednesday morning, and she'd warned me that my phone would probably light up once my mother received it. But I wasn't prepared for the sheer volume of contact that followed. 12 calls from my mother's number in the first hour alone, each one going to voicemail because I couldn't bring myself to answer. And then the text messages started, first from Charlotte telling me I was being vindictive and greedy, that I was tearing the family apart over money, that she couldn't believe I'd actually hired a lawyer against our own mother. And I sat on my couch staring at these messages from my sister who had known about my trust fund for 5 years and said nothing while I struggled, who had watched me eat ramen and work myself to exhaustion and considered that my simple life that I was apparently happy with. The demand letter was clear and professional, laying out the 4 requirements in language that Rebecca said left no room for misinterpretation. Immediate transfer of the full $3,400,000 to my control. Return of the $204,000 in trustee fees collected after my 25th birthday. Complete accounting of all trust transactions since the trust was established in 1995, and a timeline of 14 days to comply or face legal action for breach of fiduciary duty and potential fraud. My mother's voicemails progressed from tearful to angry, her voice breaking as she said I was destroying the family, that she couldn't believe I would do this to her after everything she'd sacrificed, and when I still didn't answer, she showed up at my apartment at 7 in the evening, pounding on my door hard enough that my neighbor poked his head out to see what was happening. I stood on the other side of that door listening to my mother cry and plead, saying that I didn't understand how hard it had been managing these trusts, that she'd been protecting me from the burden of wealth, that I was too young to understand the responsibility that came with that much money. And her voice was so familiar, the same tone she'd used my whole life when she was disappointed in my choices, when she was explaining why Charlotte got something I didn't, when she was making me feel small and ungrateful for wanting what my sister had freely. I pressed my hand against the door and said through it, my voice steady in a way that surprised me. You stole from me. You have 14 days. And I heard her sharp intake of breath, the pause where she seemed to be processing that I wasn't going to open the door, wasn't going to let her cry her way out of consequences, and then her crying shifted into something else, her voice going hard and cold as she said, I was ungrateful, that she'd given me everything, and this was how I repaid her, that I should be happy with what I had instead of being jealous of Charlotte, and I realized listening to her that she genuinely believed this narrative she'd constructed, that keeping me in poverty while she collected fees from my inheritance was somehow for my own good. And I walked away from the door and turned on the television to drown out her voice until finally, after what felt like an hour but was probably 15 minutes, I heard her footsteps retreating down the hallway and the building's exterior door slamming shut. The extended family got involved within 48 hours of the demand letter being sent, and suddenly my phone was lighting up with calls from aunts and uncles who I heard from maybe twice a year, relatives who had no idea what had actually happened but had apparently gotten Jennifer's version of events, which I could only assume painted me as some kind of ungrateful daughter attacking her poor mother over money. My Aunt Susan, my mother's older sister, called and launched into a speech about how family is more important than money. how I needed to think about what I was doing to my mother's health and reputation, how Jennifer had always been such a devoted parent, and I should be ashamed of myself for hiring a lawyer against her. I tried to explain the actual situation, that my mother had hidden a $3 million trust fund from me for years while collecting fees from it, but Susan talked over me, saying that I didn't understand how hard it was to be a single mother, that Jennifer had made sacrifices I couldn't comprehend, and I realized that my mother had positioned herself as the victim so effectively that the truth didn't even matter to these people. My Uncle Mark was slightly better. At least he listened when I explained about the trust documents and the explicit instructions my mother had violated. But even he ended the conversation with, "I'm sure your mother did her best, Maya. Maybe you could work this out without lawyers." Like the legal demand was the problem, rather than the 3 years of theft and deception that had preceded it. The only family member outside of Grandpa Thomas who seemed to actually hear me was my father, David, who called on Thursday evening and started the conversation with, "Your mother called me," which should tell you how desperate she is since we haven't spoken in 8 years. And his voice had this dry humor that made something in my chest unclench slightly. I hadn't told him about any of this because we weren't particularly close. The divorce when I was 18 had created distance that we'd never quite bridged. But as I explained everything that had happened, I heard him go quiet in a way that felt different from the dismissive silence of my aunts and uncles. When I finished, he said, "Maya, I wish I was surprised, but I'm not." And then he told me something I hadn't known. That part of why he'd divorced my mother was because of her favoritism toward Charlotte and what he called her financial manipulations, ways she'd hidden money and controlled access to accounts, and made him feel like he was crazy for questioning her. He said he'd had no idea about the trust fund situation, that Thomas must have set those up after the divorce, but he believed me completely, and if I needed anything, any kind of support, whether that was financial help with legal fees, or just someone to talk to who understood what Jennifer was capable of, he was there. I thanked him, surprised by how much his belief meant after days of being called vindictive and greedy. And when we hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling less alone than I had since this all started. The next morning, Friday, I got a call from Grandpa Thomas, and his voice was serious in a way that made my stomach tighten. He said he'd been thinking about the situation all week, that it had been eating at him knowing his own daughter had betrayed one of his granddaughters so thoroughly, and he couldn't let it fester and poison the family any further. He was calling a family meeting at his house for Saturday afternoon, and he expected everyone to attend: Jennifer, Charlotte, Derek, me, and himself. And we were going to sit down and deal with this properly. I felt dread wash over me at the thought of being in a room with my mother and sister, facing their anger and defensiveness. But Thomas said firmly that he wouldn't tolerate this continuing, that he was 82 years old, and he'd be damned if he watched his family destroy itself over his daughter's greed and favoritism. I agreed to come because I couldn't refuse Grandpa Thomas, and because some part of me needed this confrontation, needed to hear what my mother would say when forced to face what she'd done in front of her father. I spent the next day and a half in a strange state of anxious preparation, and at some point on Friday night, I opened my laptop and started researching what I could have done with $3,400,000 over the past 3 years if I'd had access to it the way I was supposed to. I could have paid off my $67,000 in student loans immediately, freeing myself from the monthly payments that ate up a quarter of my salary. I could have bought a house, not anything extravagant, but a real home with a yard and enough space to breathe, instead of my 400-square-foot studio with the broken heating and the neighbors who fought at 2 in the morning. I could have started the nonprofit I'd been dreaming about since grad school, the Comprehensive Support Center for Domestic Violence Survivors, that would offer legal aid and counseling and job training and temporary housing, all the services that were currently scattered across different underfunded organizations that couldn't meet the need. I made lists of what that would have cost: the startup funding and the staffing and the building lease. And I realized I could have been 3 years into building something meaningful instead of burning myself out at an understaffed crisis center, taking calls from women I couldn't adequately help. The lost time felt crushing, those 3 years that I could never get back. And I closed my laptop and cried for the version of myself who could have been living a completely different life if my mother had just followed the instructions in the trust documents and told me the truth. Saturday arrived with the kind of gray morning that matched my mood perfectly, and I drove to Grandpa Thomas's house in the suburbs, feeling like I was heading towards some kind of reckoning that would either repair my family or shatter it beyond recognition. His house was a gracious colonial where I'd spent countless childhood afternoons, and normally pulling into the driveway filled me with warmth. But today, the familiar brick facade and perfectly maintained garden felt like the setting for a trial. Charlotte's black SUV was already in the driveway along with Derek's sedan, and I sat in my 12-year-old Honda for a moment, gathering courage before I walked up to the front door, which Thomas opened before I could knock, his expression grave, but his hand warm on my shoulder as he guided me inside to the formal dining room that we only used for serious family occasions. The room felt exactly like a corporate boardroom, the long mahogany table polished to a shine, the heavy curtains drawn back to let in weak autumn light, and everyone was already seated in a configuration that felt deliberately arranged. My mother at one side of the table with Charlotte next to her, and Derek beside Charlotte looking like he desperately wished he was anywhere else, and Grandpa Thomas took his place at the head of the table and gestured for me to sit across from my mother and sister so that we were facing each other like opposing parties in a negotiation. Thomas looked older than I'd ever seen him, the disappointment in his daughter aging him in a way that 82 years hadn't quite managed, and he began speaking in a formal tone that made it clear this was not going to be a casual family discussion, but rather a structured confrontation of facts. He laid out the situation methodically, explaining that he had established identical trust funds for both of his granddaughters in 1995, that the trust documents contained explicit instructions that both girls were to be informed of the trusts on their 23rd birthdays and given full control on their 25th birthdays, that only Charlotte had been informed and only Charlotte had been given control at the appropriate time, and then he turned to my mother and asked directly, his voice carrying a weight of authority that made everyone sit straighter. "Jennifer, why did you withhold this information from Maya?" My mother had clearly prepared for this moment, and she launched into an elaborate defense that made my stomach turn, explaining that I had been unstable in my early 20s, that I'd switched majors 3 times in college, that I'd chosen social work instead of a real career that could support me, that I'd dated that musician for 2 years despite the family's concerns, and she said she'd been waiting until I was mature enough to handle the responsibility of wealth, until I'd proven I could make sound decisions and wouldn't waste the money on impulsive choices. I sat there listening to my mother essentially catalog all the ways she considered me a failure, all the evidence she'd compiled to justify keeping me in poverty while my trust fund generated fees that went directly into her bank account. And Charlotte was staring at her hands on the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes while Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wishing he wasn't witnessing this family implosion. Thomas let my mother finish her entire defense, and then he cut through it with one sentence that made the room go silent. "That was not your decision to make, Jennifer. The trust documents were clear." I sat with that silence for a moment, my mother's elaborate justifications hanging in the air like smoke that Thomas had just cleared away with a single breath of truth. And then I realized that if I didn't speak now, I would lose my chance to make everyone in this room understand what this betrayal had actually cost me in concrete terms, rather than abstract concepts of fairness. My voice came out steadier than I expected when I started talking, addressing the room rather than any one person, and I laid out exactly what the past 3 years had looked like, while $3,400,000 sat in an account with my name on it generating fees that went to my mother. I told them about working 50-hour weeks at the crisis center because we were perpetually understaffed, and I couldn't afford to turn down overtime, coming home to my studio apartment where the heating broke every winter, and the landlord took weeks to fix it. Eating rice and beans and discounted produce because my budget after student loan payments and rent left about $40 a week for food. I told them about last winter when I got pneumonia, and I delayed seeing a doctor for 5 days because even with insurance, the copay was $75, and I was trying to decide whether I needed medical care more than I needed to pay my electric bill on time. And I finally went to urgent care when my fever hit 103, and my supervisor threatened to drive me there herself. I described the nonprofit I'd wanted to start since grad school, the Comprehensive Support Center for Domestic Violence Survivors, that would offer legal aid and counseling and job training and temporary housing all in one place. All the services that were currently scattered across underfunded organizations that couldn't meet the need, and how I'd run the numbers and created business plans and applied for grants, but ultimately shelved the whole dream because I didn't have the startup capital, and I couldn't risk leaving my steady paycheck when I was drowning in student debt. I looked directly at Charlotte when I said that while she was using her trust fund to make a down payment on a $500,000 house and building an investment portfolio and starting her consulting business, I was kept in artificial poverty, struggling with problems that could have been solved immediately if anyone had told me the truth. And the contrast between our lives over the past 3 years wasn't because she worked harder or made better choices, but because she had information and resources that were deliberately withheld from me. My mother interrupted, her voice sharp with defensiveness, saying, "I gave you everything as a child, Maya. You never went without anything you needed." And I felt something crystallize in my chest as I responded with words that I'd been formulating subconsciously for days. I said, "You gave Charlotte everything as a child. You gave Charlotte information. You gave Charlotte choices. You gave Charlotte the truth about her own inheritance and the freedom to build her life with it. You gave me secrets and limitations and an entirely false understanding of what resources were available to me. And then you collected $68,000 a year in fees from money that should have been mine while I worked myself sick, trying to help people with a fraction of the support I could have provided if I'd had access to what was legally mine." The room was completely silent. Even Derek had stopped shifting in his seat, and I could see my mother's face going red, but I wasn't finished. I said that the money mattered. Of course it mattered. $3 million changes everything about a person's options and security and future. But what hurt even more was the message underlying the decision to keep it from me. The clear statement that I wasn't trustworthy or capable or deserving of the same treatment Charlotte received, that I needed to be managed and controlled and kept in the dark for my own good. And I'd internalized that message so deeply that I'd accepted struggling as my natural state, rather than questioning why my life was so much harder than my sister's. The silence that followed my words felt like it had weight and texture, and I watched my mother's face cycle through emotions she couldn't quite control, while Charlotte continued staring at her hands, and Derek shifted his gaze between his wife and me, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he'd only just realized existed. And then Charlotte stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped back against the hardwood floor with a sound that made everyone jump, and when she spoke her voice was shaking in a way I'd never heard before, because Charlotte was always composed, always in control, always the perfect daughter who handled everything gracefully. She said, and I could see her hands trembling against the table, that there was something she needed to tell us, something she should have said years ago, and my mother's expression shifted to alarm as Charlotte admitted that Mom had told her explicitly, in clear terms that left no room for misunderstanding, not to tell me about the trust fund when she'd informed Charlotte about both trusts on Charlotte's 23rd birthday. Charlotte's words came faster now, tumbling out like she'd been holding them back for so long that they'd built up pressure. And she said that Mom had sat her down in the living room of the house Charlotte and I grew up in and explained that Maya was too fragile to handle the responsibility of wealth, that I might waste it on impulsive decisions or let people take advantage of me. that Charlotte needed to be the responsible one and keep the secret for my own good, and I felt something cold settle in my chest as I realized that my mother hadn't just withheld information from me, but had actively recruited my sister into the deception and made her complicit in keeping me poor. Charlotte was crying now, actual tears running down her face, smearing her carefully applied makeup, and she admitted that she'd benefited from my ignorance in ways that made her sick to think about. That every time she saw me struggling with student loans or working overtime or living in that terrible apartment with the broken heating, she felt guilty. But she told herself that Mom knew best, that there must be a good reason I wasn't being told, that it wasn't her place to interfere with parental decisions, even though we were both adults. She said that her down payment on the house, the investment portfolio Derek thought she'd built from her salary and bonuses, even portions of their wedding that Derek's parents definitely hadn't paid for despite what everyone was told, all of it came from her trust fund, while she watched me scrape by on a social worker's salary and pretended she didn't know I had access to the same resources. Derek was staring at Charlotte with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between shock and disappointment and confusion, like he was seeing his wife clearly for the first time, and wasn't sure he recognized her. And I realized he was hearing some of this for the first time, that Charlotte had kept financial secrets from her own husband just as our mother had kept them from me. Charlotte turned to me directly, her face blotchy and wet, and said, "I'm sorry, Maya. I'm so sorry." But the words felt insufficient against the weight of 3 years of watching me struggle while she lived in comfort purchased with money she knew I should have had access to. And I understood that "I'm sorry" doesn't pay back time, doesn't restore opportunities that slipped away while I was kept in artificial poverty, doesn't undo the pneumonia I suffered through, or the nonprofit I couldn't start, or the thousand small humiliations of being broke while my sister drove her luxury SUV to our family dinners. I watched Charlotte sink back into her chair, still crying, and the room seemed to hold its breath waiting for my mother's response. And when Jennifer finally spoke, her voice had changed from defensive to something almost pleading as she said there was more to the story that we didn't understand. Something that would explain everything if we just listened. She said that she'd tried to do right by both of us, that she'd invested some of Maya's trust money in opportunities that were supposed to grow the fund even larger, but they hadn't worked out the way she'd hoped, and she'd lost approximately $180,000 trying to help me. My mother presented this supposed loss as evidence of her good intentions, saying she'd been trying to make my trust even larger than Charlotte's so I'd have more opportunities, and she looked around the table as if expecting this revelation to shift everyone's sympathy back to her. Rebecca had warned me during one of our preparation calls that my mother might claim she'd made investments on my behalf, and she'd coached me on exactly how to respond. So I kept my voice level when I asked Mom to provide documentation of these investments, to show me the paperwork proving where that $180,000 had gone and what specific opportunities she'd invested in. My mother's face flushed and she became flustered in a way I'd rarely seen, saying she'd have to look for the documents, that they were somewhere in her files, that she couldn't remember every detail from years ago, and her inability to provide immediate proof hung in the air like an admission. I pressed harder, asking what kind of investments they were, what companies or properties, when exactly the money was invested, but Jennifer just kept saying she'd need time to find the records, growing more angry and defensive with each question. Thomas had been watching this exchange with an expression of increasing disgust, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of authority and disappointment that made even my mother stop talking. He said that this admission, if it was true, might constitute embezzlement rather than just breach of fiduciary duty. That as trustee, my mother had no authority to make speculative investments without explicit permission from the beneficiary. And her claim that she was trying to help me didn't change the fundamental illegality of taking $180,000 from my trust and putting it into ventures she couldn't even document. The silence that followed was absolute, and I could see my mother realizing that her last defense had actually made things worse, that she'd just admitted to potential crimes while trying to justify her actions. Thomas looked at his daughter with something close to contempt and told her she had two choices, and he laid them out in terms that left no room for negotiation. She could comply fully with the legal demand Maya's attorney had sent, transferring the complete trust amount immediately, returning every penny of the trustee fees she'd collected over the past 3 years, and providing a full accounting of every transaction since 1995, including documentation of where that $180,000 actually went. Or he would fund Maya's lawsuit himself with his own considerable resources, and he would remove Jennifer from his will entirely, cutting her off from the inheritance she'd presumably been counting on. The room went completely silent, and I watched my mother's face cycle through shock and fear and anger, and she looked desperately to Charlotte for support, but Charlotte was still staring at her hands, refusing to meet our mother's eyes. Jennifer looked back at Thomas and started to say something about family loyalty, about how she was his daughter and shouldn't be threatened this way, but he cut her off with a gesture and said that Maya was his granddaughter and she'd been stolen from, and his loyalty was to justice, not to enabling theft. I sat watching the favoritism that had defined our family for my entire life collapse in real time, watching my mother realize that she'd finally pushed too far and that no amount of manipulation or emotional appeals would let her escape the consequences of what she'd done. 10 days later, I received notification from the bank that the trust had been fully transferred to my control, and I sat in my small apartment staring at the account balance on my laptop screen showing $3,220,000, a number so large it didn't feel real, even though I'd known it was coming. Rebecca had sent me the complete accounting that my mother had finally, reluctantly provided, and the documents revealed what we'd suspected. Jennifer could not produce any documentation for the $180,000 she claimed to have lost in failed investments. And after reviewing bank records and cross-referencing dates, Rebecca's forensic accountant believed that money had actually been transferred to Charlotte approximately 4 years ago, around the time Charlotte had started her consulting business that she'd always claimed she'd funded entirely from her marketing salary. My mother had apparently given my sister nearly $200,000 of my money, and then forgotten to mention it when she was scrambling for explanations at Thomas's house. Rebecca called me the day after the accounting came through and said we had an exceptionally strong case for a lawsuit to recover, not just the $180,000 in missing funds, but also the $204,000 in improperly collected trustee fees. And she laid out what litigation would look like: depositions, court dates, family members forced to testify against each other, probably 18 months of legal battle, and she told me honestly that we would almost certainly win. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear and thought about what that process would mean, dragging my mother and sister through the legal system, seeing them in courtroom settings, spending the next year and a half of my life focused on extracting every penny they'd taken from me, and I felt exhausted just imagining it. I asked Rebecca if I could have some time to think, and she said of course, but not to wait too long, because there were statutes of limitations to consider. I spent 3 days thinking about nothing else, weighing the principle of the thing against the cost to my own peace of mind, talking it through with my therapist, who asked me what I really wanted versus what I thought I should want. Finally, I called Rebecca back and told her I wanted to let it go. Not the breach of fiduciary duty, or the betrayal or the years of deception, but the lawsuit for the missing money. She was quiet for a moment, and then asked if I was sure, and I told her I was sure, that I had $3,220,000, which was more than enough to build the life I wanted, and spending the next 18 months fighting for another $384,000 wasn't worth the emotional cost of keeping my family's dysfunction at the center of my world. Rebecca said she understood and that it was my choice to make, and she reminded me that choosing not to pursue litigation didn't mean what they did was okay. It just meant I was choosing my own peace over punishment, and I told her that was exactly right. The next week felt surreal as I started taking the practical steps I'd been fantasizing about for years. I paid off my $67,000 in student loans in a single electronic payment and watched my loan servicer's website update to show a zero balance, and I actually cried sitting at my desk because that debt had been a weight on my shoulders since I was 22. I went to see a realtor and started looking at small houses in decent neighborhoods, places with yards and working heating, and more than one room, and I put a down payment on a modest two-bedroom house in a quiet street with old trees after years of apartment living. I drafted my resignation letter from the crisis center, giving them 6 weeks' notice because I knew how understaffed they were, and I didn't want to leave the clients I'd been working with without proper transition time. And I started seriously planning the nonprofit I'd dreamed about since graduate school, the Comprehensive Support Center for Domestic Violence Survivors, that would offer legal assistance and counseling and job training and temporary housing, all the services that were currently scattered across different organizations that didn't communicate well with each other. I met with Thomas for lunch at his favorite restaurant and told him about my plans, and he sat across from me with tears in his eyes, saying this was exactly what he'd hoped his granddaughters would do with their trusts, build something meaningful rather than just accumulating more wealth. I had $3,220,000. My mother had stolen $180,000 and possibly given it to my sister. She'd collected $204,000 in fees she had no right to, but I had enough. I had more than enough, and I was going to build something new. 6 months after the trust transfer, I stood in the small building I'd rented for Second Chapter and watched the final preparations for our launch event, and everything felt surreal in the best possible way, because this space that had been empty and echoing when I'd first toured it was now filled with purpose and possibility. The main room had comfortable chairs, arranged in conversational clusters, and there was a private consultation area where our staff attorney could meet with clients. And upstairs, we'd set up office space for our counselor and our job training coordinator, who I'd hired after weeks of careful interviews. The launch event was modest compared to the kind of fundraising galas Charlotte used to post about on social media, but it felt meaningful in a way those polished affairs never seemed to, with about 50 people gathered, including domestic violence advocates I'd networked with during my crisis center years, 2 city council members who'd expressed interest in our model, and several donors who'd contributed to our initial funding beyond what I'd invested from the trust. Thomas arrived early wearing a suit and carrying flowers for the reception table, and when he hugged me, he whispered that he was so proud of me his heart could burst. And I saw actual tears in his eyes as he looked around at what his trust fund had helped create. My father came with his partner Maria, and he spent the event telling everyone who would listen about his brilliant daughter who was changing lives, and I felt the strange, warm sensation of being seen clearly by a parent for maybe the first time in my adult life. Some of my friends from graduate school drove in from out of state, people who'd known me during those years when I was struggling with loans and working multiple jobs, and they kept saying they couldn't believe how much had changed in 6 months. The event itself was simple, just some remarks from me and from our partner organizations, coffee and cookies, tours of the facility. But when I stood up to speak and looked at the faces gathered there, people who believed in this work and in my ability to do it, I felt a vindication that had nothing to do with my mother or sister and everything to do with finally having the resources to match my commitment. I talked about the gaps in services I'd witnessed during my years at the crisis center, about women who needed legal help but couldn't afford attorneys, who needed counseling but couldn't access mental health care, who needed job skills but had no time for training while they were just trying to survive, and I explained how Second Chapter would bring all those services under one roof with coordination and compassion. The room was quiet as I spoke, and when I finished, people actually applauded, and I felt something shift inside me, some final piece of the pain from the past months settling into acceptance and purpose. After the formal part of the event ended, and people were mingling with coffee cups and conversation, I saw Charlotte slip in through the side door, and my stomach clenched because I hadn't invited her and wasn't sure I wanted her here. She was alone without Derek, dressed more casually than I usually saw her, and she caught my eye and gave a small, uncertain wave that reminded me unexpectedly of when we were kids before everything got so complicated. I excused myself from the conversation I was having with a city council member and walked over to where Charlotte stood, looking uncomfortable and out of place, and she said quietly that she'd seen the announcement online and hoped it was okay that she came. I didn't know if it was okay, but she was here, so I nodded and offered to show her around. And we walked through the space in awkward silence while I pointed out the different areas and explained our service model. When we finished the tour, Charlotte asked if we could get coffee sometime and really talk, and something in her voice was different from our last conversation, less defensive and more genuinely uncertain. We ended up at the same coffee shop where we'd had our terrible confrontation 6 months earlier, and sitting in that same corner booth felt like some kind of full circle moment, though I wasn't sure yet what kind of circle it was. Charlotte started talking before I'd even finished stirring sugar into my coffee, and she told me she'd been in therapy for 4 months, working through the family dynamics that had shaped both of us in different damaging ways. She said her therapist had helped her see how mom's favoritism had been a burden as much as a blessing, how being positioned as the golden child meant she'd never developed a real sense of her own worth separate from external achievement, and how watching me struggle while she had resources she hadn't earned had created a guilt she'd suppressed by telling herself their mother knew best. I listened without interrupting, and Charlotte talked about how the launch of my nonprofit had forced her to look at what she'd done with her own trust fund, how she'd bought things and made investments but hadn't built anything meaningful. And she said she was starting to realize that mom had given her money and opportunities but had given me something more valuable by accident, the necessity of developing real purpose and strength. She asked if there was any path to sisterhood again, any way we could rebuild something from the wreckage of our family dynamics, and her eyes were red like she'd been crying before she came. I thought about that question carefully because I'd been working with my own therapist on this exact issue, trying to figure out what relationships I wanted to preserve and which ones I needed to let go and how to tell the difference. Finally, I told Charlotte honestly that maybe there was a path forward, but it had to start with her seeing me as an equal rather than as mom's project or her responsibility, and it meant accepting that I didn't need her protection or her pity or her guilt. I just needed her to be my sister if she could figure out what that meant. Charlotte nodded slowly and said she was trying to learn exactly that. And she asked if we could start over in some small way, maybe meeting once a month for lunch or coffee, just the two of us trying to know each other as adults rather than as golden child and overlooked daughter. I agreed to try, though I made no promises about where it would lead, and when we parted ways outside the coffee shop, there was something tentative and fragile between us that felt like it might possibly be the beginning of something real. One year after Thomas asked me that question at family dinner about how I spent my trust fund, I sat in my modest 2-bedroom house with my rescue dog Charlie curled up beside me on the couch and looked at the annual report second chapter's board had just approved. And the numbers told a story I could barely believe. In our first full year of operation, we'd provided comprehensive services to 32 women transitioning out of dangerous situations. We'd partnered with 8 law firms willing to do pro bono work. We'd placed 17 women in stable employment through our job training program. And we'd secured enough grant funding and private donations that my initial investment from the trust could be preserved and grown rather than depleted. My life looked nothing like it had a year ago when I was living in that studio apartment with broken heating, eating ramen, and working 50-hour weeks at an understaffed crisis center for $42,000 a year. And sometimes I still woke up expecting to find myself back in that old reality, as if this new life was just an elaborate dream. I had $3 million in investments managed by a fiduciary Rebecca had recommended. I had a house with a yard and working heating and a second bedroom I'd turned into an office. I had savings and security and the freedom to build something meaningful without constantly worrying about money. My relationship with my mother had settled into something minimal and carefully boundaried. Occasional text messages on holidays and birthdays, no visits, and no real conversations. Because Jennifer had never truly apologized for what she'd done, and still maintained whenever anyone asked that she'd been doing her best and protecting me in some twisted way I would supposedly understand when I was older. I'd accepted that I would probably never get the acknowledgement I deserved from her. Never hear her admit that she'd stolen years of opportunity from me because of her own issues with control and favoritism. And surprisingly, I'd discovered I was okay with that, because my peace and my purpose didn't require her validation anymore. Charlotte and I had been meeting monthly for lunch for 6 months now, and it was still sometimes awkward and careful, but we were slowly building something that felt like it might eventually become real sisterhood, both of us doing the work with our respective therapists, to see each other clearly, rather than through the distorted lens of our mother's favoritism. Thomas came to visit second chapter once a month, and always left with tears in his eyes, telling me this was exactly what he'd hoped his trust fund would make possible. Giving his granddaughter not just financial security, but the freedom to build something that mattered and helped people who needed it most. My father called every week to check in and tell me how proud he was, and I'd started to understand that I'd had one parent who saw me clearly all along, even if he hadn't been able to protect me from Jennifer's manipulations during my childhood. I thought often about that dinner when Thomas asked his innocent question about the trust fund, how his genuine confusion had unraveled years of carefully maintained deception, how one moment of truth-telling had changed the entire trajectory of my life. The money had changed things, absolutely, giving me opportunities and security I'd never imagined having. But more than the $3 million, what had transformed me was learning the truth about how I'd been treated, understanding that the limitations I'd accepted as natural were actually artificially imposed, realizing that I wasn't less deserving or less capable or less important than Charlotte. I'd just been kept in the dark by people who should have protected me. Second Chapter had become more than just a nonprofit I'd founded. It was the embodiment of everything I'd learned about helping people escape situations where they were undervalued and controlled, where they were told they were less than they were, where their worth was systematically denied by people who claimed to care about them. Every woman we helped find legal representation, or counseling, or job training, or temporary housing was living proof that circumstances could change, that the narratives other people imposed didn't have to define you, that there were second chapters possible even after years of being kept small. I'd found my second chapter in the ruins of my family's dysfunction, built something meaningful from the trust fund that had always been mine, but had been hidden from me, transformed betrayal and loss into purpose and healing. The trust fund was always mine. Thomas had created it for me the same year I was born. But now, finally, my life was mine too, lived according to my own values and dreams, rather than shaped by my mother's limitations and lies. And that freedom was worth more than any dollar amount in any account.